You probably disagree with her on 95% of the issues, but you have found that 5% where you can work together. Talk about that relationship.
Well, in a sense, it's not really an issue. You can't call the whole constitutional democratic infrastructure an issue. So, you know, what we're agreeing on is essentially who we are as Americans, that we can agree to fight about lots of stuff. I mean, I told Liz I can't wait to going back to disagreeing with her about everything, you know. But right now, I mean, we are in a constitutional emergency, and we are all constitutional first responders.
Constitutional first responders. I love that. Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. It may have been met with some laughs in the moment, but the message from Congressman Jamie Raskin there is a deeply profound one in these times. Speaking to how, despite their political differences, he and at the time fellow January 6th Select Committee member Liz Cheney were able to find vast amounts of common ground and common understanding and respect for one another because they were fighting on the same side for the same goal. The very right to debate issues with each other in a free and fair American democracy. The fact that their unity on that issue of whether we remain a democracy was so notable is emblematic of a much more ominous problem plaguing our country right now, today. The inability of Republicans to see beyond party affiliation. It has now morphed into an inability to agree to a certain set of facts, reality. And this polarized reality, which we refer to as Earth 1 and Earth 2 on this show, threatens not just our democracy, but our very way of life. If we can't agree that there is indeed climate change, we can't move toward debating the solutions. If we can't agree that there's no evidence of fraud in our elections, then we can't view the outcomes as legitimate. If we can't agree that political violence is abhorrent and unacceptable in every single instance, then none of us are safe. In all three of those examples, large swaths of self-identified Republicans are in the evidence-free zone, which we call Earth 2, not exercising a right to their own free speech or free ideas, but demanding a right to dictate their own facts without any evidence. So what we're left with, all of us, not just them, is a country being ripped apart at the seams in a very precarious moment in our history. In the name of the Republican Party's leader, an ex-president who's been indicted twice, who's been found liable for sexual abuse, impeached twice, many members of the Republican Party have spread vitriol and hate, some by adopting the rhetoric themselves, others by ignoring it, others by refusing to condemn it at all. Take what was just posted by former Trump administration official, a man named Peter Navarro. And when you watch this, keep in mind, no one in the Republican Party has called out this dangerous language.
Roughly half of Republicans and over a third of Democrats believe America is on the brink of civil war. If such an unthinkable war breaks out, it will be the Democrats' fault. The Democrat activists and strategists now driving this nation towards a second civil war have neither justice nor righteousness on their side. My strong admonition to these Democrats, as I appeal to the wiser in your party, is this: back this anti-democratic truck up before it runs over you.
Are you kidding? If the audacity doesn't hit you in the face, the hypocrisy and projection will. So that guy goes on to warn Democrats that their so-called weaponization of government and DOJ and other government agencies is going to, quote, come back to haunt you? I'm sorry. It's an alarming threat, given that a second federal indictment of Donald Trump for crimes he committed in Earth 1 is likely imminent. And following the first indictment from special counsel Jack Smith, a larger number of Americans now support using force to restore Donald Trump to the White House somehow, some way. According to a new University of Chicago survey, that number, quote, increased by roughly 6 million people in the last few months to an estimated 18 million people. A growing number of Americans who believe violence is justified, coming ahead of a likely third indictment of the ex-president, is where we begin the hour with some of our most favorite experts and friends. Former Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the U.S. Department of Justice, Mary McCord, is back. Also joining us, Paul Rieckhoff, host of the Independent Americans podcast and the founder of the group Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and former Assistant U.S. Attorney, now the president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Maya Wiley is with us. Mary, I start with you. When you and your smart peers who have sort of sat at the intersection of U.S. national security with an orientation toward threats from abroad, where I think I know from my time in government exactly what we would do if a foreign terrorist organization or an American adversary threatened us. What is it that we do when prominent figures or someone from the ex-president's cabinet threatens us?
Well, right. This is the challenge because domestically, speech is protected by the First Amendment, and that has been interpreted very, very broadly to protect almost everything including things that can sound pretty threatening unless they cross over the line into sort of what's called a true threat. And that means the First Amendment does not protect violence or incitement to imminent violence, but the line about where that is and when a threat becomes that type of incitement to imminent violence or violence itself is something that the courts have struggled with over time. And I think that that's been essentially weaponized by extremists to really push that envelope and try to stay where they feel is just on the protected side of the line. I think it also means that prosecutors are hesitant sometimes to prosecute when they worry that they might not be able to obtain a conviction because there'll be a determination that speech was protected, or even a jury determination, if it was not a legal determination by a judge, even a jury determination that something really wasn't a true threat. And so we get more and more and more of this type of extremist language that, when you take the comments you just showed of Peter Navarro, he wasn't actually making a direct threat, right? He was really, I think, trying to inject into the public consciousness this idea of civil war, which he has to know, because we've seen it over and over and over again, will cause individuals to start talking about that on social media, to start maybe even mobilizing around those types of things. I do think, though, we need to take what he said, and even more importantly, the new data out of the University of Chicago, we need to consider that in terms of how easy it is to say things, to talk about civil war, to talk about things on social media, to answer polling about your views about political violence, to answer these things very in an abstract way. And according to other researchers, and I've talked to Robert Pate from University of Chicago and also to other researchers, and oftentimes if you then drill down with your questions into specific things that a person would think it's acceptable to do, the answers sometimes change a little bit. I think questions in the abstract about would the use of force be justified are very abstract questions. They're very generalized. And I don't want to mitigate this threat. I mean, as you know, Nicolle, I talk about political violence all the time. But I also don't want to alarm Americans into thinking that, a large number of Americans really are ready to take up arms in civil war against their fellow Americans. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're in a very dangerous place because of the rhetoric, and that brings fear to people that prevents them participating in democratic processes. And that's one of the things we really need to worry about, in my view, even more than are we really going to have war on the streets of the United States of America.
Well, Mary, from a law enforcement perspective, does that make it easier or harder to find the people that would break into Speaker Pelosi's home, the guy in New Mexico who would shoot up Democratic election workers? I mean, it seems that the task, and I don't know if the terrorism parallel is a good one or a bad one, but finding a lone wolf radicalized terrorist and finding a group both seemed vexing endeavors for the U.S. government.
Right. That's one of the hardest things, because the type of rhetoric like you heard from Peter Navarro and like you hear from other extremists, and the condoning of that, either explicitly, as you indicated, by elected officials or by their silence by other elected officials, that does oftentimes lead, I shouldn't say oftentimes because it's not as though we have a terrorist attack every day in the U.S., but that does sometimes lead to individuals acting out on the kinds of things that they see and they believe are happening in the United States. And most of our terrorist acts, including our domestic motivated, not foreign terrorist organization motivated, but domestic extremist motivated targeted attacks are usually carried out by individuals and not by groups. And oftentimes those individuals are inspired by and motivated by the propaganda of groups, including disinformation, conspiracy theories, etc., but they act on their own. And that is very difficult for law enforcement. I mean, law enforcement also, some of the tools that would be the most useful to try to ferret out those individuals are the tools that make people who stand up for privacy and civil rights and civil liberties very nervous. Right now, our law enforcement, they have to have predication to do things like create online undercover personas and engage with people in private chat rooms. And it's important to have that predication so that we don't have overreach by our federal law enforcement and surveillance of Americans, just based on unfavored political views. But that is far different than, of course, trying to ferret out violence. And where that line is, I mean, the director of the FBI has been clear, like once there's, and he's right about this, when there's any discussion about violence or acquiring weapons or that kind of thing, the FBI can move. But whether they always do that and they do it in a timely fashion, it's hard. It's a huge challenge for our law enforcement.
Paul, Mary articulates really artfully what the Republican political and rhetorical strategy is. It's to find the space beyond what used to be a normative border of acceptable rhetoric, right up to speech that crosses the line into illegal incitement of violence, and just plant roots, build their bunkers, and that's where they hang out. And you and I have had a lot of conversations about the asymmetry in language. I wonder how you assess, the rhetorical response to that.
Well, the threat of civil war, I think, is exaggerated. And it's something that people like Peter Navarro are actually encouraging and want to root on. I think the threat of extremist violence is real. I think the threat from what I've called not a civil war, but an American insurgency is real. It doesn't take 18 million people to coordinate attacks on infrastructure or political leaders or disrupt our government or our elections. So I continue to look at this as a national security story, not just a political story. It's an entire extensive network from Trump to Navarro to Mike Flynn to the Oath Keepers all the way around that don't necessarily have to be coordinated. They just have to have the same objectives. And sometimes those objectives are just chaos. And when you've got any number of people who are angry, who are politically motivated, who share values and have weapons and have consistent messaging coming from people like Peter Navarro, it's a real threat. So the FBI has got to be on guard. I always remind people, the FBI is still looking for attackers from January 6th. The pipe bomber that set pipe bombs outside the DNC and RNC is still at large. The FBI is still hunting for people who are participants in January 6th. So the threat is real. And I think the reality is also that there are people like Peter Navarro who want to see it increase.
Yeah, I mean, Maya, this is this extraordinary split screen, though, right? We live at this unprecedented moment where the threats are domestic, not foreign. In terms of modern history, that is a new normal. We live at this heightened threat of, as Paul said, an American insurgency of extremist views and people that are willing to act on them based on the polling. But if you go down issue by issue, and I had this conversation with former Attorney General Eric Holder, on the big issues that historically have divided us, there's no more division. Abortion is not even a 50+1. It's like an 80% issue of people think it should be legal in all or most instances. Making it easier to vote, not a 50% issue, not a 50-50 issue. Again, depending how you ask the question, 70 to 90% of Americans, and if you include younger people, it's even higher, think you should make it easier to vote in the United States of America. Gun safety, it's an 85% issue. Should we do more things to make so the divisions are on the tools. Peter Navarro talking about civil war. They're on the appetite for violence. That's all on the right. They're on disinformation. It's all consumed and mainlined by actors on the right. And they're on this silence, this complicit silence in terms of the highest levels of elected officials. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy condemn none of this. What do we do about that?
I can't help, Nicolle, but go back to your previous segment with Reverend Sharpton and Eddie Glaude. Because really, at the heart of all of this and what we do about it is recognizing not just what you are saying about the fact that we have much more agreement in this country than disagreement, and I really agree with both Paul and Mary in terms of their analysis here. It's that 62% of Americans, according to our polling at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights that we conducted last September, where we certainly got a large number of people deeply concerned about the health and future of our democracy, but 62% also saying that this country had to face down anti-Black racism. The reason I point that out is because underlying all of this in the what we do about it and why there's complicity in silence from too many leaders who in the past, including Mitch McConnell, would have supported reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, the very kinds of constitutional norms and Supreme Court protections that we have had as a country to ensure that we had come beyond and surpassed the racism that we had had and the institutionalization of it that we fought a civil war over. And now today, what we're really seeing is the complicity in people thinking about how they hold on to some very short reigns of power because there is a base that I think is the minority of the American public that is simply and sadly incredibly deeply ensconced in conspiracy theory and fiction over fact, and in a lot of insecurity and fear about the future of the country that's leading them to grasp theories of division rather than the fact of unity. That, to me, speaks to exactly what we do about it, which is we have to collectively recognize as a country and in every single community where we have people who say we actually have civil rights. Civil rights are constitutional rights. We fought a civil war, and it was to perfect this union, and we can still perfect it. We can still keep it, and we have to do what, frankly, and again, in our polling from last fall showed a majority of Americans want, which is to have politicians that stop participating in a politics of division and show up, vote. If we have learned nothing, it's that elections have consequences. And think about, am I showing up? I don't care which party. Am I showing up for candidates that are trying to solve problems or create them, are trying to take responsibility or avoid it, or are trying to drive division or pull us together? And I'm going to tell you right now that just like you said, Nicolle, this is a country where the vast majority, including the segments of our demographics, the Gen Zs and the millennials, the plurals as we call them, are going to inherit this country, and they are very clear about what they want, and it's a democracy.
Paul Rieckhoff, what does that look like in action? Because I know you sort of sit at the fulcrum of peering over into two abysses, if you will. What does that sound like?
Well, I think that there's a core point here, which is a lot of Americans are up for grabs. I wouldn't dismiss it as just something that only people on the right or watching Fox News can latch onto. I mean, we're in a battle for hearts and minds. And there are people who are on the fence. You've got to have leaders and messages and messengers and programs that get to those people, that bring them over into community organizing and into nonprofit organizations and away from the Patriot Front and the Oath Keepers. And I think the parallels with 9/11 are important. We've talked about this before. After 9/11, the laws didn't work. Like, they made massive changes to respond to a new threat. And I think we have to face the fact that many of our structures, laws, and policies may not work. After 9/11, we created the Department of Homeland Security. There was the Patriot Act. There was massive change in our entire society to face the #1 threat, or at least what was communicated as the #1 threat. I think we need the same kind of tectonic shift. It's got to be much more than see something, say something. But maybe our laws need to change to respond to the fact that someone like Mike Flynn, the former National Security Director, is openly calling for violence consistently.
Yeah. All right. To be continued, please. Mary McCord, Maya Wiley, and Paul Rieckhoff, thank you so much for starting us off this hour. The latest episode of Paul's podcast is out right now. He's joined by our good friend, Amy McGrath, and they talk about how the military is dealing with efforts to restrict abortion access. Shifting gears for